allowing a what literally might be a get-out-of-jail-free card to those who aren't in truth working in the public interest, but are simply prepared to dig around for stories that have no public interest at all.
That's right, and exactly. And issues of corporate governance like that could be where a new regulatory mechanism could help. Could help to sort of maintain the right sort of standards, non-statutory though they might be, in the day-to-day operation of those kind of checks and balances within the newsroom.
Yes, but at the same time, one's got to see how the criminal law interfaces with that, and at some stage, possibly may have the chance to get back to it. I'm sorry, Mr. J.
Paragraph 28, Mr. Clegg, general elections. Can we just take as a vignette, if that's the right way of describing it, the last general election and your experience?
Vignette.
There was a...
It's not how it felt, but anyway.
Yes. Well, there was, I suppose, one good moment that after the first TV debate, there were three debates, as we know, on the 15th, the 22nd and the 29th of April. There was has been described as a spike in your poll ratings, but then there was coverage in some elements of the press which was hostile to you. I mean, first of all, what was your view as to the objective reality of the spike, if I can put it in those terms? Was it synthetic, or did it genuinely reflect a underlying increase in support for you?
I think my view at the time was fairly sort of pragmatic. I was conscious of the fact that, from the public's point of view, many people weren't really aware of who I was and what the Liberal Democrats were putting forward in the general election. So the widely watched television debates were as a sort of... The new bit in that for the public was the fact that I was there saying stuff that was different to David Cameron and Gordon Brown, and that had an effect, self-evidently, at a time when the public was weary of the outgoing government and was not fully persuaded of the most prominent alternative, the sort of Conservative proposition. So there was an appetite for something different, and to that extent, perhaps with hindsight, that's surprising that when an alternative, something different was put forward, people responded to that. But I have to say, I never got sort of that swept away with it, because I've seen, even in my time in politics, that fortunes go up and down quite rapidly. It's a volatile business, and you should never pin your hope on one spike or one opinion poll. It tends not to work like that, as indeed it didn't in the event. Our final result on election day fell far short of the expectations which were sort of hyped up around the time of that first television debate.
There was one comment piece in The Guardian on the 18th of April, which was 3 days after the first debate, written by Mr. Yelland. It's under tab 30 in this bundle. And of course, he was editor of The Sun in the late 90s. My recollection is right. Between, I think, 98 and 2002 or 2003. And he made the point that your rise could lock Murdoch and the media elite out of UK politics. Which indicates, I suppose, what his assessment of your lack of proximity to the Murdoch press. Is that fair?
I think he makes a perfectly fair point, which is just a statement of fact that for large parts of the press, in the run-up to the general election, I don't think I'm putting it too strongly when I say the Liberal Democrats were a subject of indifference at best and derision at worst. And he describes his own experience as editor of The Sun, that there was almost a sort of instruction to to deride or ignore the Liberal Democrats. So if that's what you're used to in the press, it must come as a bit of a shock, I guess, when you suddenly have these people who you've been either ignoring or deriding suddenly doing well in a general election campaign. And that, you know, you can just self-evidently, the reaction of some parts of the press was pretty ferocious after that, because things from their point of view were not going according to plan. If you've placed your bets in favour of other parties and suddenly this upstart party, if you like, intrudes on the plan, you panic a bit and you start lashing out a bit, which is what happened. And that's exactly how I saw it. I didn't find it surprising. I still don't find it surprising. That's the nature of politics. That's the nature of the alignment between particular parties and particular press groups. And if you have aligned yourself with one team, the blue team or the red team, and suddenly the yellow team comes in, you want to get them off the field of play. And you do that by, in a time-honoured fashion, not going after the ideas, but going after the, how can I put it, going after the man, not the ball. Again, that's as old as the hills.
Well, there was, I suppose it might be described as a backlash against you following the first debate, and we've collected some of the media pieces between tabs 26 to 29, the Daily Mail, the Express, the Telegraph and the Sun. The Sun perhaps the most vitriolic at tab 29. But
yes,
pardon me. But I suppose you'd say that if we're not going to legislate for the fusion of fact and comment, or in any event, this sort of thing is inevitable, and you just have to accept it. Is that your view?
Well, look, the editorial of The Sun on that day said, that is why The Sun makes no apology for repeating the obvious warning, vote Clegg, keep Brown, which has to be one of the worst political predictions in modern times. But just because they made such spectacularly inaccurate predictions doesn't mean that I, or I think any politician, should seek to somehow prevent them from making those predictions or issuing those warnings to their leaders. And as it happens, I mean, to be fair, that is exactly what editorials are about. Editorials are about expressing partial opinion. And I would defend the right of The Sun or any other newspaper to express vociferously partial partisan views to my dying breath. They seem to be barking up the wrong tree in this particular instance, but that's their prerogative.
Thank you. Can we move now to paragraph 62 of your witness statement, please? Which is at page 13810. 13810. We're out of general elections now to the issue of media campaigns. Again, can I ask you to develop orally the points you're making there about newspapers being valuable campaign tools, but also whether newspapers genuinely act in the public interest as reflecting their constituency?
Well, on the first point, do they act as effective campaigners in their own right? Yes, they do, and often with great effect, and fairly often, I think, to the benefit of the country at large. Some of the campaigns I mentioned here, I think the Daily Mail's outstanding campaign on bringing the murderers of Stephen Lawrence to justice was a brave campaign, and entirely justified. The Guardian's dogged campaign, if that's what you call it, to not take no for an answer and keep plugging away at this issue of phone hacking. I suspect if they hadn't stuck to their guns, we wouldn't be sitting here today. I remember being very involved with a number of media outlets on the campaign to give retired Gurkha soldiers the respect and the support they deserved here. Again, that's something I would welcome. My only point is, as a politician, you quite rightly need to be dispassionate about which campaigns you act upon and which you don't. if we get to a point where the intensity of the campaign determines whether they're successful, that would not be right. It's got to be whether the campaign is right in content, as these three examples I've used are. And again, I think it is one of the great virtues of our press, certainly compared to slightly more insipid press cultures in other developed democracies, that we've got this sort of campaigning zeal in our press. I think readers appreciate it, and it's something I think we should celebrate.
But are there any risks which you perceive?
Well, the risks, as I said earlier, is just simply that government, in particular, and politicians in government have always got to be clear that they are deciding things in the public interest and for the benefit of the country as a whole, and not just in response to the loudest voices in the strongest campaigns in the press. That is, in a sense, stating the obvious, but I don't think one should underestimate how powerful a well-organised, orchestrated, sustained press campaign is, and of course the overwhelming temptation for politicians to want to respond positively to campaigns on the whole, because they think that will then communicate itself positively to the public. But as before, I think as long as politicians remain objective as much as they can and sceptical, but open to new ideas, I think it can be a healthy thing.
Thank you. May I move on now to a separate topic? This is under question 7 and starts at paragraph 36 of your statement, Mr. Clegg, our page 13804. This is the issue of your own personal approach to engaging with media proprietors, editors, etc. And in paragraph 36, you point out that the meetings or engagements or interactions fall into 3 main categories. They're the formal meetings, interactions at social events, and informal discussions. And you differentiate between those in your exhibit. May we look, please, at your exhibit 1, which is tab 2, and starts at 13817. We're looking first of all at meetings before you entered government, and starts 26th of February 2008. And as with others, if one scans the next 4 pages, you see a whole range of proprietors, editors, broadcasters, and it's impossible really to pick out any patterns. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean the looking back on it, I'm not sure if this is an irony, but the interesting thing is that I actually feel that the regularity of my contact, not just with editors and proprietors, but with journalists and political editors and so on, forgive me, was actually much more intense in opposition than it is in government. And I think that's partly actually because of the physical location of where I was working. If you're in opposition, you work in Westminster, so you physically share the same space in Westminster as journalists do. And Portcullis House is just wander through that, and you'll always have passing conversations with any number of journalists. And the interesting thing is, of course, if you're in government, you move into Whitehall, and you're slightly more, well, you are considerably more cut off. And so the nature of my interaction with proprietors, editors, political editors, and so on is in a sense much more formal, and I would say much more sparing now than it was when I was in opposition. Not that the intensity of that contact in opposition necessarily shifted the underlying indifference towards the Liberal Democrats, which I alluded to earlier. But
I just raise one matter in relation to this list, and it's really a point which doesn't simply apply to you, but applies to virtually everyone else. That under the column "What discussed," we see always general issues. Say when, of course, it's the party conference. I mean, it may be said to be oppressive and possibly counterproductive to have a whole list of topics discussed on particular occasions. But do you think that more information might be routinely supplied or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd be hard pushed to provide a sort of ad verbatim account. I'm not sure if anyone would really want to. I mean, all of these meetings are a whole lot less intriguing and surprising, I suspect, to the outside world than it might initially seem. A lot of them are fairly humdrum, but I suppose one could just, in very telegraphic form, just mention 2 or 3 issues which were prevalent in a discussion. Frankly, I just simply do not remember the precise content of a huge number of these interactions, not least those stretching back some years.
Well, particularly where you've not been asked previously to record them and there hasn't been a formal system. Of course there can't be a note because that would ultimately destroy the informality of some contact. But at significant times, do you have an observation on the idea of noting, as it were, in 2 or 3 words, general topics, just so that actually you would be able to refer back and say, well, no, actually, we never talked about X or Y, but Z?
Yeah, I've got no problem with that at all. As it happens now, if I now meet an editor or a proprietor on my own, I will, as a routine matter of course, if something is raised which touches on official government business, then of course relay that to officials in my private office. So, there's not a great leap between that and just jotting down on a piece of paper or telling someone that these are the things that were raised. And invariably, not always, but I mean, these conversations are distinguished as much as anything else by informality, humour and gossip. But invariably there will be 2 or 3 issues which predominate.
And those first 3 categories are very important, and I understand that, and one doesn't want to do anything to minimise the sort of links which then are part of you putting out your message and them challenging you, holding you to account, whatever form of language you want to use.
Yes, but as I said earlier, the editors and proprietors have a unique ability to access politicians, often on their own, in a way that people from other domains of public, corporate, economic life do not. And sometimes beyond the politics, they will make points which comes back to some of the earlier conversations we had about the press being sort of lobbyists on their own behalf. Quite understandably, they've got their own commercial interests, they've got their own vested interests, and they want to communicate those. But they're in a category of their own because they're able to do that in a sort of, how can I put it, a sort of context of intimacy that is not extended to anybody else.
And that's part of the trouble.
That can be, yes.
Risk is a better word.
Yes, it is. I mean, I had a number of conversations with editors and proprietors of news organisations who were very hostile to the B-Sky B bid. Quite understandably and rightly, they took the opportunity to say to me, "We don't like it for X, Y, Z reason." Didn't act on their views, and obviously made it clear that this was a process being dealt with in its own sort of box, if you like, quasi-judicially by as it turned out, 2 secretaries of state over a period of time. But nonetheless, that is quite I can't think of any other area where a commercial interest will be able to come to a senior politician and privately say, "I don't think your government should do X or Y because it harms our commercial interests." But the best antidote to that is that politicians, as I say earlier, just keep their distance, and refer the issue where it impinges on formal business to the formal government system.
2 particular lunches we might discuss. The 22nd of April 2008, it's James Murdoch and Rebecca Wade.
Which?
That's page 13817. And then there's another one just James Murdoch, 16th of July 2009, 13819. On those occasions, may be difficult to remember, but did Mr. James Murdoch discuss issues such as Ofcom, BBC licence fee, for example?
I just think it would be unfair of me to pretend that I can remember. All of those meetings were, of course, I became leader in February 2008. Many of these people didn't know me from Adam, so in the first year or two, I was just keen to take opportunities to explain who I was, what my thinking was, what my ambitions were for my party. I'm afraid I simply don't remember.
Thank you. There are two occasions only when I think you met with Rupert Murdoch. The first is the 16th of December 2009.
Yeah.
It was a dinner, Rebecca Brooks,
yes,
John Witherow. So was it just the four of you?
No. There were a fairly large number of people there. And as it happened, I was at the very end of the table, where the children sit, so to speak, and didn't have. I only had very fleeting interaction with Rupert Murdoch before the dinner, and as I said goodbye at the end.
Thank you. Then
I felt, I was an observer as much as anything else.
On the 13th of January 2010, we see dinner with a group of people from the Telegraph stable. Was that? Did you enjoy sort of more pride of place on that occasion at the end of the table again?
That was very much a sort of series of meetings and lunches and indeed dinners in the run-up to the general election, and that the discussion was very much there, centred on what my plans were for the general election, manifesto ideas. It was purely political and purely centred on me trying to persuade the Telegraph, a paper which I never had any illusions would not come anywhere close to ever endorsing the Liberal Democrats, would nonetheless give us a fair hearing.
Thank you. And about two months or less before the election, on the 16th of March 2010, you've made a small addition to the original version of your exhibit. That after the lunch with Mr. Merron and Mrs. Brooks, there was a brief meeting with Mr. Murdoch and Mrs. Brooks. Is that right?
I think meeting is quite a ambitious noun for what happened. My recollection of it was that as I was leaving the lunch. But anyway, Rupert Murdoch was in the building, and I exchanged literally a few sentences with him of perfectly civilised, amicable greeting in a corridor in the building where the lunch was being held. Thank you.
Now, since entering government, which is the second phase, as it were, you've grouped these under two rubrics. The first is the smaller, more formal meetings and phone calls. It starts at 13820. How many of these would be one-to-one without even an advisor there?
I think a fair number of them. There's not really any pattern to that. Sometimes an advisor would sit in and sometimes not, and it would usually be decided fairly sort of spontaneously, partly depending on my judgment of what the person I was talking to would prefer. So there was not really any rule. But, I'm afraid I just don't recollect, but a fair number of these would have been meetings where I would have met particularly individuals on their own, one-to-one.
And then we see one meeting with Mr. Paul Dacre, the 22nd of July 2010.
Yeah.
Was that one-to-one, do you think?
Yes, that was one. It was the only time I met Mr. Dacre since I've been in government. He was in my office, and I remember distinctly I made an attempt to interest him in the case for electoral reform, and he explained to me his concerns about the B Sky B bid, which of course had been announced the month before, I think we made as little impression on each other, if you sort of mean, on both points.
Ships that pass in the night.
No, well, I mean, I said to him, hear what you say, and the Telegraph group had also, I remember, the bid, and and to be fair to Mr. Dacre, he was very explicit. He said, "I know you can't comment on this, and you're not sort of in charge of this." And I said, "Absolutely not. This is a quasi-judicial decision being dealt with by the Secretary of State for business at the time."
Well, others may have been bending your ear about the bid as well. I mean, on the 17th of August 2010, there was a lunch. Mr. Harding, Rebecca Brooks, and James Murdoch. Did you get, as it were, quiet words from the other side on that occasion, or not, to the best of your recollection?
No, I don't. I remember distinctly having. It must have been very much sort of in the air at the time about when we as a government would hold a referendum on a change to the electoral system, which was quite a sort of politically charged issue. I remember that being devoted. We devoted quite a lot of time to that. That was obviously something close to my heart, and where I was keen to take every opportunity, whether it was with Mr. Dacre, Mr. Harding, or Rebecca Brooks or James Murdoch, to put my case for change. In the event, I don't think I made much of an impression, but that I do remember in the lunch. That was a subject of conversation. I do not remember the bid coming up in that lunch at all.
Well, certainly the impression is, and you've confirmed this already, Mr. Clegg, that since being in government there have been fewer meetings with editors and proprietors, and possibly since the summer of last year there have been even fewer, but I haven't added them all up. But that's certainly on.
There was a phase where I remember, and I'm sure this is reflected in the sort of chronology set out here. There was a phase where I was very proactively on this in the run up to the referendum in May 2011, where I, of course, I was very keen to try and interest people in the press in the case for a change to the electoral system. So I think that may be reflected in the rhythm of some of these entries, and that after May and the summer of last year, that then sort of subsided a bit.
Now, in paragraph 39 of your statement, you deal generally, this is page 13805, with the content of these discussions without alighting on any particular event. And you make it clear that in opposition the discussions tended to be quite general, focusing on general policy issues of concern to their readers rather than on media policy itself or the commercial interests of a particular news organisation, although on occasion media policy and commercial issues did arise. That's the sense of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
We move forward to paragraph 41, where you make reference to Mr. Michel, and you explain that you've met him in opposition both socially and formally. Can I ask you please to tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've known Fred Michel and I have sort of first met each other many years ago. I can't even put a date on it. Well before I was even thought of entering into British politics. When I recollect, I don't know when this must have been, a decade or more, no, even more ago, he was working at the time for a centre-left think tank, the name of which I've forgotten. So that's when I first came across him, and then our paths crossed from time to time, and then latterly we so happened to, our children go to the same school in southwest London. So I very much knew him well before he was employed in his current capacity, and knew him socially as well.
You haven't seen him, you say, since September 2010, and you haven't discussed the B-Sky B bid with him?
No, not discussed the B-Sky B bid with him. And again, as it happens, since the general election in May 2010, my social contact with him, as it says here, is very, very infrequent indeed. In fact, there was one dinner where we were both invited to someone we both know in Putney in September of 2010.
Thank you. Paragraph 47 now, please, Mr. Clegg. The issue here is the extent to which political support by the media for any individual party or policy is discussed at such interactions. And you make it clear that the topic is certainly raised as far as you are concerned. But are we to understand that this is the last sentence of paragraph 47, this is only in relation to newspapers that share your party's liberal values? Is that right?
Well, I'll give you an example. Before the last general election, I never once entertained for a millisecond that the Daily Mail or the Sun or the Daily Telegraph would come out in support of the Liberal Democrats. But that didn't mean that I felt it was a waste of time to try and seek to explain to them what I stood for, what my plans were for the party, so that, if not in their editorial stance, but nonetheless in their coverage, they would give us fair hearing. And I would still do that today. Then there were other newspapers, I suppose notably the Independent, the Guardian, the Observer, where I felt there was just a much stronger convergence of worldview, if you like, which I hoped would lead to a more explicit form of endorsement, which happily did occur. But as I said in my written evidence, I don't think one should get sort of overly sort of hung up is not quite the right word, but I mean I don't think one should devote an undue focus on the editorial written by a newspaper in the week of a general election, because I actually don't think that shifts very many votes one way or the other. My own view is what has a much, much bigger effect on the public's view of politicians as people and their parties is the sustained prism through which they are described over a sustained period of time, and that is immeasurably more important.
In relation to the three papers you've named, were there direct and explicit discussions along the lines, you asking the editor or whoever whether they would be supporting the Liberal Democrats at the election?
Yes. And as is reflected in one of the exhibits in the bundle, there were, for example, if one were to look back on the editorial written by The Guardian in support of the Liberal Democrats in the run-up to the general election, the editorial speaks for itself. They were very explicit that the reason why they were, from The Guardian's point of view, breaking with existing precedent of supporting the Labour Party at that time was because of their support for electoral reform, which they thought was most likely to happen if the Liberal Democrats did well in the general election. So it was very much a sort of issue-specific endorsement, if you like, which of course was the subject of discussion. I observe, by the way, just not to sort of make any wider points, but I observe that, as it happens, that support didn't last very long because The Guardian, for perfectly understandable, I don't agree with it, but perfectly reasons which are entirely legitimate for them to hold, were disillusioned with the creation of the coalition, the Liberal Democrat entry into it, and when the referendum on electoral reform happened, which was the issue upon which they had supported us, The Guardian was quite sort of ambivalent towards it. So, it just shows these things can change, very quickly.
Well, in the example you've given, there can be no question of any implied deal because your policy has been the same for decades, or certainly since the merger of the Social Democrats and the Liberals in 1987 or whenever it was. But is there a danger here of the sort of discussion you're describing becoming transactional? I'm talking more generally, not in the particular case.
I think there is. I mean, without saying semantic about it, any discussion is a transaction. It's a transaction of views and opinions, and of course there is. If you have a conversation between two entities, two people, parties who both want something from each other, you've got the ingredients for a transaction. I don't think you can legislate against that, but as I say, you need to guard against that becoming a means by which good government and is warped and the public interest is undermined.
Paragraph 51 now, Mr. Clegg. This is media influence on public policy.
Just before you change subject to that, just on the same topic, could I ask this? It has been suggested, it's also been denied, but it has been suggested that there is a difference between the approach to journalists that was certainly adopted by the Labour Party after 1992 and up to the 1997 general election, which then they took into government, which, as I say, there's been a difference of opinion. Some say that was a mistake, some say no, that seemed reasonable. I appreciate that your position looks at the whole problem from a slightly different perspective, but I'm interested in your view as to whether there is or should be a slightly different relationship between the way that you try to tell your story when you're in opposition to the way in which you do when you're in government, and whether there are risks there. To some extent you comment by saying that well, there's just less contact and it's more policy specific, but there is a more general issue there which I'd be very interested for your view on from your perspective.
No, there is a general issue because your function clearly in government is utterly different. You are no longer just single-mindedly seeking to promote your views and the sort of partisan advantage of your political party. You suddenly wear another hat, which is a wider duty to the public. And there are certain issues where you have a very big duty to, I don't know, inform the public of changes in the way in which benefits and welfare operate and are accessible to them, or public health issues where government has a objective role where it needs to get its message across on issues of overwhelming public interest, where we serve the nation, and I think it's fair to say that the skills of sort of partisan political promotion in opposition aren't quite the same skills as that of public information that you adopt in government, which is why the division of labour between government press officers, who are officials working on behalf of the government, not a political party, and political media appointees is a very important one to get right.
Yes, and do you think there is or has been demonstrated to be a risk that the mechanism for selling the message has been taken sometimes from opposition into government in a way that has undermined the integrity is too big a word, but the balance with which the message is actually being told?
I mean, I think the comments both in this inquiry and elsewhere from people like Alistair Campbell sort of speak for themselves, where he I think says with hindsight we just kept up this frenzied tempo of wanting to dominate the headlines every single day that we had successfully deployed in opposition, and we sort of carried it through in government. And if I stand it correctly, I think, I hope I'm not putting words into his mouth, I think his sort of feeling is with sort of hindsight, they should have been less concerned about the press earlier.
I think that's absolutely right, and it was his evidence that I was reflecting upon when I was asked the question. I just wondered whether you'd seen the temptation of that as you stepped from opposition into government, and whether it's simply a mindset that all new ministers have to get into so that they actually do understand that their role is now different.
Well, it's clearly a big learning exercise for any party and any set of individuals who enter into government for the first time. It's a very different sort of environment to which to work in. But to be honest, I was in such a different position to that of the Labour Party in 1997. As I explained earlier, we didn't have any big media groups who were sort of batting for us. In fact, we were constantly batting for any attention whatsoever. I mean, it was a completely different dynamic. So we just came at it from a totally different trajectory. I also think, of course, coalition government is one of the many, many differences. If you are a single party going into government with the team that you had in opposition transplanted directly into government, so everything remains intact. Coalition is a mix and match of different teams, and the Prime Minister and I had to fuse two teams together from two totally different political perspectives in pursuit of a new whole, a coalition government, and that by definition means you can't carry on doing what you did in opposition going into government because you are working in a completely different political setting.
So your experience doesn't really allow you to comment one way or the other about the underlying point because it's so different. Except, what I'm seeking to say is there was simply, in my experience, because of the circumstances of my party, the creation of the coalition, and so on, simply no prospect that we would merely carbon copy what we were doing in opposition the moment we walked into government. So it was just inevitable that we were going to do things quite differently in government than we were doing in opposition.
Paragraph 51 to indeed 56 deals with the safeguards which exist within your party in relation to the evolution of policy to avoid pressure from outside organisations, or unacceptable pressure from outside organisations intruding. Can I ask you please to summarise those paragraphs for us?
Well, quite simply, it's not something I'm immensely proud of as leader of the Liberal Democrats. We just have a very open, deliberative, democratic process of policy making. Unlike any leader of the Liberal Democrats, it's sometimes frustratingly painstaking. It takes a while, and it's based on a series of working groups which look at policy X and produce papers which are then debated in our party conferences and then amended and voted on. But I think it is a wonderful sort of innocuous